The book of Esther, Megillat Esther, is filled with so many beautiful themes about the fact that the name of God is not explicitly said in the Megillah, so to find God in the world, or about people switching roles from the lowly Mordechai becoming second in command to the king, overcoming Haman. So many beautiful themes. One of the really important themes is the idea of Jews living in exile and how they deal with their different identities. And to understand that question, or to put it in more stark contrast, welcome Jane, is to talk about the historical context of the story of Esther. So we don't know exactly when this takes place, partly because we're not 100% sure on the identities of the different players. There's different theories and hypotheses in the Midrash, et cetera, about who everyone is. But we know that this does take place after the destruction of the first temple, meaning the Jews have been exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, will come up later in our story, by the Babylonians. They've been sent out of Israel. So this happens after that. But since then, the Persians, who takes place in Persia, have defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great has started sending Jews back under Ezra, Nehemiah. And in fact, at this point, the second temple, the Beit HaMikdash HaSheni, the first temple, has been rebuilt. So the second temple is up. So one of the first questions before we read any of this is, what are these Jews still doing there? They have Israel back. They have the temple back. Why are they not in the land of Israel? Now, tonight we're not going to get the answer for that, but it puts this whole conversation, makes it much more relevant today, because we have Israel back. Israel is our holy sacred land, yet all of us are living in exile. So what does that mean? What does it mean for our identity, for a people who God has basically, according to the Torah, set up all of history so that our people could end up in the land of Israel? Now we have the land of Israel, yet we don't live there. So what does that mean? Who are we if we're not in Israel? And the first question that I have here, even though this is about the experience of living in exile, which again, very relevant for today, and you'll see that come out, is Mordechai a Jew? Now, I don't mean, is he not part of our people, a descendant of Yaakov, and does he need to fulfill the mitzvot of matzah? When I say a Jew, the question is today, when we think about what is a Jew, and what does it mean for someone to identify as a Jew, or for someone to be called a Jew? John Stewart is Jewish. I don't think he goes to synagogue. I don't think he studies in a yeshiva, but he's certainly Jewish. So what does it mean to be a Jew? And how does the book of Esther help us explore that topic? So I'm actually going to go ahead and take the first source, because it's very important, I hope you'll see why, for the first source to be done in Hebrew. And of course, I'll translate, and you can look at the English. So this is only in the second chapter of Megillat Esther, quite early on, and it starts talking about Mordechai. First chapter, Vashti and Esther and everything like that. Mordechai is now identified, and it says in the Hebrew, Ish Yehudi Haya Beshushan. Ish meaning a man, Yehudi. Now we usually translate the word Jewish, and you can actually see here in the translation, they don't translate it. They just transliterate it as Yehudi, and we'll see why they don't translate it and why I'm hesitant to as well. So this Yehudi man was in Shushan Habira, in the city or the fortress of Shushan, this city, Ushmor Mordechai, and his name was Mordechai ben Yair, ben Shimi, son of Yair, son of Shimi, ben Kish, Ish Yemini. So all of these people, his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and he was this Yemini, this right-handed man. We're going to come back to again what that means, but we know the names of his ultimate, the patriarchs of his family, and we know that he's a Yehudi and he's a Yemini. Yes, Jane, and then I'll leave you unmuted to take on the next source. Go ahead, Jane, please.
First of all, who's the translator in this case?
So this was copied and pasted. I'm not sure if it's JPS. Oh, you mean because they did it as Benjamite? So that's already jumping ahead to a Talmudic assumption there. That's generally the assumption that he is, more than an assumption, there's a lot of evidence that he is from the tribe of Binyamin. And Binyamin literally means Ben, son of Yemi, of my right hand.
But that's really different than Yemini.
No, absolutely. But again, as we'll see in the Talmud, nobody disagrees that he's not a descendant of Binyamin, to the point where they're going to actually it's going to create a great contradiction, which will lead into our second source. But that's a great thing to pick up on. So the second source here is based on an interesting contradiction, because it says Yehudi and it says Yemini, which everyone understands as Binyamin. Okay, what's the contradiction? Binyamin is the name of one of the 12 tribes. Yehuda is another one of the tribes. So what does this mean that he's an Ish Yehudi and he's an Ish Yamini? Is he from the tribe of Judah, or is he from the tribe of Benjamin? Or does Yehudi mean something else entirely different, which is where it will be the jumping off point? So Jane, the Talmud in Megillah 12b proposes 4 different solutions. So it has a little introduction, which proposes the contradiction, and then it has 4 attempts at explaining how it's possible that he's clearly from the tribe of Benjamin, but it says he's a Yehudi. So Jane, please.
It calls him a Yehudi, implying that he is from the tribe of Judah. And it calls him a Yemini, implying that he is from the tribe of Benjamin. A, Rav Nachman said Mordechai was crowned with religious honorifics.
To explain that one is this idea that calling someone a Yehudi, which was the premier tribe, they're the leaders, the kings, everything like that, to call someone from the, I don't know what the equivalent would be today, but to call someone as if they're from the tribe of Yehuda, that's an honorific title. Even though he's not a descendant directly of the tribe of Yehuda, to call them the Yehudi, even if from the tribe of Dan, Yisachar, etc., it's a crown of honor, as it were. And that's a very good possibility, and many run with that, but they continue on, please.
B, Rabba ben Bar Chana said in the name of Rev Yehoshua ben Levi, his father was from Benjamin and his mother was from Judah.
So again, so maybe he has both Benjamite, ancestry
From a
and
mixed
Judahite
marriage.
one. What's that?
He's from a mixed marriage.
Mixed marriage, except, and by the way, for the first one, many reject it because no one has ever done that. No one has ever given honorific title from another tribe. B is rejected because we certainly all know today that paternity rules. Well, actually, today it's maternity rules, the maternal rules the day. But in that generation, for thousands of years, it was paternity that ruled the day. You would never, in classical Jewish texts, identify someone by their mother. Not that they would never be mentioned. Some mothers were important, but for better or worse, everything was paternity. So it'd be very unusual to identify someone both by their mother's and their father's tribe. So that's not that these are all 100% wrong, but they're very unlikely explanations for this seeming contradiction if we read it as a contradiction. Please continue on, Jane.
C, the rabbis say the families were competing with each other. The clan of Judah said, we brought it about that Mordechai was born since David, the Judite, did not kill Shimei ben Gera, Mordechai's ancestor. The clan of Benjamin said, he is one of us.
So the incident that goes behind this C, and by the way, the Talmud did not break them up this way, I did so, is the story going back to when King David was being chased by Saul, and one of Saul's soldiers cursed David, because he was against him. And when David found out, David had the opportunity, this happened several times, David had the opportunity to kill King Saul and didn't, because he loved him and he was his friend, and he had the opportunity to kill this person from the tribe of Benjamin, which is Shaul's tribe, and he decided to spare his life. And because a man from the tribe of Judah, David, spared the life of a Benjamin, Mordechai, who is a direct descendant of him, they're assuming that this is a direct ancestor of Mordechai, that Mordechai would not be alive if not for the mercy of someone from Judah. So even though they don't have direct bloodline, as it were, his very life is owed to David. Now, this is midrashic, but it is a well-known classic. Actually, this is actually something that happened in the text. This understanding is a midrashic. So again, it's not the strongest answer, but it's certainly a possibility. So that's the explanation there, is because someone from the tribe of Judah saved your life, you identify with them because you wouldn't exist without them, which again, that's just a peculiar thing, not really done. And then the last suggestion of the Talmud, welcome Ken, go ahead, Jane, D.
Rabbi Yochanan said, really, he is from Benjamin. So why does it call him a Yehudi? Because he rejected idol worship. For anyone who rejects idol worship is called a Yehudi, as it says, is that book of Daniel, Don? 3:12. There are certain Yehudim.
So the context of this, and well, actually the next source is a midrash that'll elaborate on D. And in some ways, I feel like D is not so different from A, which is that it's, you're clearly from one tribe, but because of some action you did, you're given a special title. So it's not so far off. But in the Daniel, this is actually referring back to when Nebuchadnezzar had started the exile, and he was trying to push the Israelites towards idolatry. He's actually pushing it over all of the land, and all the other nations and all the governors from all the other places that he conquered were all adopting idolatry. Who were the one people that said, no, we will not worship your foreign gods? Were the the Jews. And in fact, the text in Daniel says there were these specific Yehudim. There were Yehudain in Aramaic. There were these Jews. And Jane, for 20 points, do you know who those three Jews were? There's a famous song, I feel like maybe Al Jolson or someone like that saying a version of it.
No.
Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. I mean, that's
Oh,
the English. I think there's some classic bass that's saying some version of it.
Joe, and Mojo and Larry, but I don't think that's
I'm sure those were based on the Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Right. But the text talks about them rejecting idolatry, but it calls them Jews. So this midrashic explanation is that whoever stands up against idolatry is given the special title of Yehudi. Now again, this harkens back to A here, which is the idea that Yehudi is not just the title of a tribe, it becomes the title of what our people stand for. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Oh yeah, Jane, go ahead.
But the Judah is the region with the tribes that are not exiled, so we all become Yehudim. Isn't that so?
So we're going to come back to that, because that idea of calling everybody Jews happens much more in the time of the Romans. The idea is certainly present here, and in fact, we're going to look at that. So that you're absolutely right, Jane, and we're going to see that explicitly in the book of Esther, because after this next midrash, almost all of the sources are going to be from the book of Esther. And one of the things we'll see is that the book of Esther is not entirely sure what it means to be a Jew. Is it where you're from? Is it your tribe? Is it your religion? It's fascinating how it explores it. And again, it has to do with the experience of exile, is how do we identify ourselves? So this midrash just kind of builds on in a very cute way that last thing there about being Yehudi is not your tribe, it's what you do. So Gloria, if you would take source 3, please, from Esther Rabbah, this midrash on the book of Esther.
Was he just confrontational, violating the king's decree? Rather, when Ahasuerus commanded his people to bow to Haman, Haman placed an idol on his heart and intended that people would be bowing to the idol. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow, he was filled with anger. So Mordecai said to him, "There is a master whose pride is beyond all of the proud. How can I abandon him and bow to an idol?" Since he unified the name of the Holy One, he was called Yehudi, meaning Yechidi, unique.
Now, this is really sweet, but there's a couple of jumps here that hopefully I'll be able to help make more sense. So again, that idea that Yehudi doesn't refer, so what Jane said about it might refer to a region or a tribe. We're going to get to that in a second. Everything we've really seen up till this point has been midrashic, or not a very strong argument. And this is the most midrashic of all, which is that by Mordecai standing up for the oneness of God and rejecting idolatry, he brought the Yechid, the unity of God. Well, so what is his name? Is he Ish Yehudi, the Jewish man, or is he Ish Yechidi, the man of unification? And what this midrash says is it's the same thing. Why? Because in classic or old Hebrew, and you could probably find this maybe with Yemenites, the letter He and the letter Chet sounded very similar. So for them, it would be Ish Yehudi, Ish Yehidi. And I don't know how well it comes over on Skype, but it's both, they would pronounce it gutturally. So it kind of sounds similar, the unique man, the unifying man, and the Jewish man. So again, it's totally midrashic, but that's their first crack at it. They see an inherent contradiction here because they know that Mordecai is not from the tribe of Yehuda. So what does it mean that is a Yehudi? So they had all these different explanations, and not all were midrashic. The idea of identifying with his mother or his father is not midrashic, but again, it's not really done. So maybe that is actually the reason, but it doesn't seem as likely. So after this, we're going to jump in again to the book of Esther, where I'm going to propose other possible solutions. And we're going to see that again, even the book of Esther isn't 100% sure what it means by someone being Jewish. So before we go on, Susan, I saw that you had your hand up. If you still have your question.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
I thought, wasn't Benjamin one of the tribes that was destroyed, exiled?
You mean by fellow Jews?
By the Assyrians.
Yes, but that doesn't mean they were wiped out. There were still descendants, or Mordecai wouldn't exist.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So, I mean, this is an interesting, that brings up an interesting thing. Those tribes that were, in the north, the many tribes, the 10 tribes, what happened to them is they weren't wiped off the face of the earth. What happened to them is a lot were killed, a lot were exiled, and that's appropriate here. These are the tribes that are in exile. Mordechai is living in exile, and they didn't go back. So what happened to those missing tribes? Are they in a magical land somewhere in Africa? No, they probably ended up staying in the other places in the Middle East and Iraq, and either they're still, their descendants are still there, or they converted to other religions, but certainly not Mordechai, or they got subsumed into other tribes, which is kind of what really happened to all the tribes. Everyone kind of got sucked up into the biggest tribe of all, which is Judah. So that's an excellent question, Susan, about what's going on here. But historically, at this point, the identity of people's tribes is still known, which makes it so weird that Mordechai would be doubly identified or seemingly doubly identified. So what we're going to see now is that the book, again, the book of Esther, is going to explore some other understandings of what Judah is, including one that Jane mentioned. So Leonard, if you would take, and we're going to jump around, we're not going to go in chronological order. Our focus here is not on the narrative of the story, it's how the word Yehudah or Jew is used. So Leonard, if you would take source number 4, please.
He had been exiled from Jerusalem, with the exiles that were carried into exile along with King Jeconiah.
Yeah, Yechonia or Jeconia, however you want to pronounce it.
Which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon.
Excellent, thank you. So this one is basically what Jane had said. So this verse is right after we identified Mordechai. The first verse we started with was 2:5, this is 2:6, and it says that he had been exiled from Jerusalem. He was one of the exiles. He didn't go back with everyone, he was still here. And it says he went along with King Yechonia Melech, King Jeconiah, of Yehudah. But the question is, what does Yehudah refer to? Now, in the southern kingdom of Israel, Yehudah was both the biggest tribe and they were the ruling tribe. But at some point, it wasn't just an identity about who your great-great-grandfather was, Judah, one of the brothers. It became the province, the area of Judah. But the question is, if you lived there, but you were from another tribe, which was what basically happened, would you be considered a Judahite? Or would you still be identified by your tribe? But the reason this verse isn't our, oh, well, that's the answer, he just came from Judah, is because this is just, the way it's used here is a province from the land of Judah. It's not referring to him as the tribe of Judah, it's saying it's from the land, the area of Judah. And specifically, once the Jews were moved to Babylon, they were all set up in provinces. And we know from the book of Esther, there were 127 provinces. So if you're from the province of, Timbuktu, but you're a Jew, you'd be a Jew from Timbuktu. That rhymed, that was very good. But you wouldn't be identified, or you wouldn't be duly identified as a Jew and a Timbuktu, and you would be identified by your province. So if Judah was a province and he didn't live there anymore, then he wouldn't be a Jew anymore, he'd be identified as a Benjamite. So there's something not quite right here, because the Jews were usually identified by where they lived. They were given a specific, of the 127 provinces, they were given a specific area. So he should have been referred to as Mordechai from the Bronx or something like that, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. So again, we're not 100% sure what Judah refers to here because it's not his tribe and he doesn't live there anymore. That, to be clear, that's the issue here. It's not his tribe and he doesn't live in Judah anymore. So why is he still called that? So it is possible that maybe the text decided to call him that because they're focusing on where he came from. But again, that wasn't really what was done in the times of Esther. They were identified either by their tribe and where they live now, or just by their tribe. So the other possibility is that he's not being identified by where he lives. He's being identified, and this is where we're getting into it, by his people. And maybe the idea is that even though the Jews of the 127 provinces, areas talked about in the book of Esther, even though the Jews had one of those provinces, there were kind of Jews everywhere. So you didn't want to say the Bronx Jew or the East Side Jew or the Ohio Jew. You just want to start calling them the Jews. But the idea of doing that is fairly new, which I think is why the Megillah is kind of confused. The idea of identifying all of our people by calling us Jews when we each had a tribe was weird. So in Esther 3:6, let's see, Elizabeth, if you would take this, please.
But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, having been told who Mordecai's people were. So Haman plotted to do away with all the Yehudim throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus, Mordecai's people.
And so this is actually Mordecai, not Mordecai, this is Haman talking with his wife, and he's talking about what he's so angry about, or that he's so angry at Mordecai, and he identifies him and all of his people as Yehudim, Jews. So this idea of calling all of those people that are exiled from Jerusalem as Yehudim, again, it's starting to develop here. That's why things are confused and why the Talmud is confused by this, because the idea of us being the Jews is a new concept. Before that, we were either our tribe or we were Bnei Israel. But calling us all Jews as one people just didn't make a lot of sense yet. And you actually see 2 verses later, and Elizabeth, you can take this as well, is more as Haman is adding another layer to what does it mean to be a Jew? And what's really interesting here, and both troubling and interesting, is that he's definitely not identifying us by where we live. He's identifying us by something else. And this gets into the question of what does it mean to be a Jew today? So go ahead, Elizabeth, source 6, please.
Their laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them.
Thank you. So this idea that the Jews have a separate religion, that they have laws that are different from the laws of the rest of the people, and they still adhere and abide by them, and they won't bow down to you, because we don't bow down to idols. We brought a religion with us. So he is connecting the idea of being a Jew to a religious practice. So again, that idea, even though obviously we had a religion and everything like that, the idea of connecting what it means to be a Jew in exile and identifying us by our religion, and then Haman deciding to kill us, not by where we're from, not by who our father is, but by our practices and our belief system. This is an idea that we can start seeing, and you do see this in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and later books, the idea of anti-Semitism. That idea of racism, anti-Semitism, it's the original hatred of our people, of Amalek and everything. That wasn't because we were Jews, it was just because we were an enemy and Amalek was evil. We'd fight with other nations, but they all had their religions too. We just fought because that's what you did. But here, specifically identifying these outsiders by their religions as this Jewish nation who doesn't belong starts to really build up in these later books, and specifically in Exile. And again, it's so relevant because this is not a commentary. I know I'm adding my own commentary, but this is in the text. And we also see this here in America. We saw it in Europe, that idea of identifying the Jew by their blood, by their religion, etc. This is something that's been going on since time immemorial. So any questions before we go on with the last few sources? Good. Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And Ken, if you would please take, so they're going to explore this, I'll have you read this next source and then we'll unpack it. But the context of this, I actually brought in 2 different sources here. So one is very early on. It's actually when Ahasuerus was looking for a new wife, and he sent out letters everywhere, and he sent it and talks about how there's so many different provinces. And then the next one is when Esther and Mordecai send out letters to everyone saying, we're going to war against the people who tried to defeat us, and we're going to have a party, all those different things. But again, it's look at how the mechanics of how letters were sent out in Persia at this time. So go ahead, please, Ken.
I guess one thought that occurred to me,
Yeah, please.
Unlike Lenny, because he's from the Bronx and I'm from Brooklyn, I still, after how many years, too many years, get identified, oh, you're from Brooklyn. So it could be, that the languages of Mordecai and his people were the unique thing. And that happened to be one of the things that was foremost in other people's minds, because it was still maybe not that many years or generations within Babylon at that time.
Yeah, so. And I think one of the things is, again, we don't know 100, when it calls him an Ish Yehudi, we don't know 100% what that means, but the point is that we see that phrase, that word Yehudim and Yehudi used so many different ways throughout the Megillat Esther that it's clearly exploring what does it mean to be that? Does it mean that you're Bronx? Is it your religion? Is it who your father is? And we see these vestiges. None of us here, well, that's not true. Some people are still identified by being the descendants of a Cohen or a Levi, but most Jews don't use that anymore. But this is the time when people could still, as Susan's question pointed out, people could still be identified by their tribes. But there was a new identity either being embraced or imposed upon our people. And we still struggle with that today. When I go out, and I'm a rabbi, so for me, I'm a Jew everywhere I go, but a lot of people, depending on where they are, who they're with, their observance, people struggle with what does it mean to be a Jew? Do I happen to be a Jew because I was born that way? Or am I only a Jew if I practice? And if there's somebody who doesn't practice, I'm not a Jew. I'm not even Reform. I'm not identified or whatever it is, unaffiliated. So go ahead, Ken, please. Source number 7.
Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, and to every nation in its own language, that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. And letters were written at Mordecai's dictation to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors, and the officials of 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language.
Excellent, thank you. So this kind of is more proof sort of for an earlier idea that we proposed, is that the Jews, most people are in a province. You know, Persia is a massive empire. And in it, you have, here might be a modern example. In Chinatown, you generally have a large percentage of the population of Chinese people. Now, they're also identify as American, but uniquely you would point to them. And I don't mean in like a racist way, but that's, you know, you have Chinatown, you have Little Italy. And in fact, in certain states, you do have like Muncie, you do have the Jewish neighborhood. But here, what you see is a unique thing where you can't say, there's the land of Israel where the Jews live, or there's the land of Israel, that's their people. There's the land of Syria, that people. Here you have Jews everywhere. So you can't just say the Jews are, you know, that's their neighborhood, that's their ghetto. Jews are suffused into all of society. So how do we identify them? You can't identify them by where they live anymore. You can't even necessarily identify them by their tribe anymore. There has to be some other way to point them out. And that, in some ways, not led to anti-Semitism, but became a tool of anti-Semite in Europe in World War II. But it also became a tool of Haman thousands of years ago. And that's in some ways quite wild. And you actually see this expanded. Here, Ken, if you want to take source number 8 as well.
Sure. And many of the people of the land Jewified themselves, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them.
So the Hebrew, I'll look real quick. So this is when Mordecai was given permission by Achashverosh to basically fight back against the mercenaries and kill them, large numbers, like 75,000 or something like that. But there were a lot of non-Jews who were afraid that they would get caught up in the attack. So in the Hebrew, Verabim me'amei haaretz, and many of the non-Jews, though from the other nations, and this crazy word here, I don't know if it exists anywhere else, but it's in Hebrew, mit yahadim. It takes the word Yehuda and it turns it into a verb. So the translator here, and I do actually know the translator of this because we're going to read a piece from him at the end, Ophir Yarden, who is an Israeli scholar, professor, translated as Jewified, but I think he has a really great translation there, which is that these people adopted something of the Jews. Whether they dressed like them, they pretended to, the rabbis actually debate, did they convert or did they pretend they had a nice Yiddish accent that we were watching Fiddler, what do you want from us? Whatever it means, but it also is very powerful proof that the identity of the Jews wasn't just a people from a land. There was something distinct about the Jews. They could be identified again, whether by their dress or by their religion. So they were a people outside and others recognized that in them. But the final point here is that, again, it's still not so simple. So we said, well, it's not just tribal, and it's not where they came from, and it's not where they live now. So maybe it's their religion, maybe it's their culture. Well, in Esther 6:13, sorry, I misidentified something I said earlier. Haman was actually talking to Achashverosh in the earlier thing where he's talking about the Jews. Here, he's talking to his wife, and how the Jews are identified here is fascinating. Susan, if you would go ahead and take source number 9, please.
Okay. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin.
Excellent, thank you. But the key phrase here again in the Hebrew is when it says Jewish stock, it's the phrase in Hebrew is Mizera HaYehudim. Zera is seed, i.e. someone who is descended from, but directly there's a bloodline there. Again, certainly Jews can convert. This is not denying that, or people convert to Judaism, but this is also identifying the fact that Mordecai has Jewish blood. So it's not his culture, it's not where he's from, it's not his religion, it's that he is a descendant directly bloodline born of Jews. So Esther, I'm not going to say that it's I'm blanking on the phrase right now, but it's like all over the place there. But it clearly is exploring what does it mean to be a Jew in exile, and it's still struggling with that because in many ways it's a new idea. Jews never had to think about it before, and in fact, classically, when we talk about in modern Israel a separation of church and state, in many countries, both currently and classically, that idea is foreign. They're all the same thing. There's no idea of religion. There's no idea of state. It's all one big thing together. And there's no idea of people who are, I mean, there might be conversion, but everyone is just, we're of that people. We are all members of this nation, and we happen to practice and believe the same things, at least officially. But the idea of someone being able to live in another land and maybe be culturally like that land, but religiously different, or religiously like that land, but culturally different, and so on and so forth. Esther is struggling with what that means. And so are we today. And the final piece that I'll read here, there's a beautiful piece that I based a lot of this on and got a lot of these sources from by this scholar, Ophir Yagen. He actually teaches at Brigham Young University in Jerusalem. And it's fascinating. So I actually couldn't find out if he himself is Mormon or Jewish. I think he's Jewish. He does a lot of interfaith work, but whatever it is, he's clearly a brilliant scholar, and he lives in Israel. So here's what he says, and this in some ways also kind of summarizes a lot of what we've seen. Esther, meaning the book of Esther, ignores the status of Judea in the Persian Empire to focus on the position of the Jews living outside of Judea vis-a-vis their non-Jewish neighbors. So it goes back to your point, Jane, about, oh, they're from Judea. And there's clearly some kind of shift here anymore. It's part of the conversation, but it's clearly moving away from that. They could go back to Judea. They're choosing not to. They're creating a new identity that never existed before. They were the people of Israel, but they're choosing to not go back to Israel. So what are they? And we've been people in exile for thousands of years. So we've had thousands of years to perfect this and deal with all the consequences of it. So it continues, the reality of living in exile as a minority group invites a conscious grappling with issues of identity and the sharp distinctions between us and them. And today, particularly with nationalism and refugees and everything, many other groups and throughout history as well have dealt with that question about what does it mean to be a Chinese American? Am I an American Chinese, Chinese American, et cetera, like that, or Japanese American, Syrian American, Jewish American? Plenty of people are dealing with the same issue that we are today. It continues, thus, the Megillah's concern is about Yehudim, Jews, being perceived as outsiders, different, even a fifth column. It reflects the anxieties and fears of a culturally and religiously distinct minority grappling with their place and their future in the larger Gentile society in which they were a minority. This struggle began 2,500 years ago, but remains fresh until the present day. So while this may not be the main point of Purim, it does beg the question about what does it mean to be a Jew outside of the land of Israel? And once we can start answering that question, it can help us figure out our identity. And Purim in many ways is a holiday where we're proud of our identity. We're proud of being Jews. We celebrate it. We make a big party about it, but we also have to stop and ask our questions. What does that mean that I'm a Jew? Because the story starts with Esther hiding her identity as a Jew. And the whole thing about costumes is hiding your identity. And a huge part of our history is hiding our identity. But what does that mean to hide our identity? Does it mean to join another religion? Does it mean to dress like others? Does it mean to live in different places? And a lot of Jews have rejected that. They dress distinctly from everyone. They make sure the religion is the only thing that defines them. They live in specifically unique communities. So that's a struggle. And there's, again, different extremes to how Jews have responded to this question of identity outside of Israel. If we all lived in Israel, I don't know what it would look like, but we don't. Just as Esther and Mordecai lived in exile, so do we, and we are dealing with the same questions they dealt with thousands of years ago. What does it mean to be a Jew in exile?